morning, good afternoon, good evening, my beautiful people. My name is Delbert Richardson, and I call myself a second-generation storyteller, community scholar, ethnomuseumologist. I bring to you great joy. It is June 19th, the date we've known as Juneteenth, when the official day when all of my ancestors were set free. What I'm getting ready to share with you is a story about Juneteenth that will give you more context, understanding, and appreciation why we as Black people, African American people, of the people of the diaspora need to honor and embrace Juneteenth as our official day of liberation. There are some that say July 4th is the day of independence. Yes, it is, but that's 1776, and we weren't free. So as I take you on this spiritual journey of American history, please keep in mind that 155 years ago, our ancestors celebrated this day, freedom from our chains. Thank you. Jubilee. In June 19th, 1865, a hot day in Texas, clouds decorate the bright blue sky. On a farm outside of Galveston, a man hoes corn. 5 miles away, a teenage boy chops wood. Nearby, a woman scrubs the floor. Her sister milks a cow in the barn. It seems like a normal day. Then, a message arrives in Galveston. It races from ear to ear through town. The message is carried to the courtside by riders on horsebacks. It is carried by wagon and by people on foot. The people on foot are running because the message is so important. When the news reaches the man in the cornfield, tears roll down his cheeks. 5 miles away, the young woodcutter plants his axe in the stump and runs to hug his father. Nearby, a woman stops scrubbing and dances across the wet floor. Her sister drops a bucket of milk and falls to her knees. As the news spreads across Texas, people stop working and jump for joy. These men and women and children were not ordinary workers. They were Black slaves. That news on June 19th changed their lives forever. On that day, General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston. President Abraham Lincoln, he ran an order from him. The order said the slaves were free. This was good news, but it was old news. President Lincoln had given the order in 1863. But slaves in some places were not told right away. It took more than 2 long years for the order to reach Texas slaves. When it finally did, the streets of Galveston rang with Black voices shouting, "We're free, we're free! Free, free, free!" Slavery. But how did Black people become slaves? Imagine, just imagine, that you are playing outside, suddenly you are captured in a net like an animal. You are packed in the bottom of a ship with many other stolen people. You are taken far away from another country. You are forced to stand naked and on a platform called an auction block. A man pays money for you. He owns you now. You are his slave. You must do everything he says, and he can do whatever he wants to you. He can make you work, he can put you in chains, he can even whoop or kill you, and you never, ever again see your home or your family. Beginning in 1619, these things happened to millions of African people. They were taken to North America and to other places as slaves. Why did Americans want slaves? Some people in the North wanted housekeepers and farmhands. Many Southerners needed people to work on their plantations. Plantations were huge farms for cotton, tobacco, corn, and other crops. Plantation owners sold those crops to make money. The owners could keep more money if they didn't have to pay the people who worked for them. They didn't have to pay slaves. Not everyone wanted slavery, however. Many people in the North and some in the South wanted to free the slaves. They knew that slavery was wrong, and they spoke against it. They believed that all people are created equal. Most Southerners did not want slavery to end. Without slaves, who would pick their crops and chop their wood? Who would cook their meals and clean their houses? Also, many white people believed that black people were not equal, so slaves did not deserve to be free. Northern leaders would not give up, and the Southern states would not give in. Finally, a group of Southern states decided that they could no longer be a part of the United States. They broke away and formed the Confederate States of America. Now, the country was divided into two parts, the Confederacy in the South and the Union in the North. On April 12, 1861, armies from the two sides began to fight. This would start what we call the Civil War. On January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln signed a special order called the Emancipation Proclamation. It said that slaves in the Confederate States were forever free. Many plantation owners did not tell their slaves about President Lincoln's order. You see, they wanted the slaves to keep working. Even when the owners knew the South would lose the war, they wanted one more free harvest. But Union soldiers brought the news to slaves as the troops moved through the South. Those slaves spread the word to others. Thousands upon thousands of freed slaves joined the Union Army to help win the war. Some Texas slaves heard tales about freedom, but they couldn't be sure if these stories were true. Slaves had to be careful. If they even talked about freedom, the owners might punish them. Slaves who tried to leave the plantation would be whipped or killed. All they could do was wait and hope. Finally, in April 1865, the Union won the Civil War. More than 700,000 people from the North and the South had died fighting in the war. On June 19th, Union General Granger brought the news of freedom to Galveston. Texas was the last state where the official announcement was made. Not everyone believed the announcement. More than 20 years had passed since Africans were first brought to North America.
Start when more than 20 years have passed.
Okay. Not everyone believed the announcement. More than 20 years had passed since Africans were first captured and brought to North America. By 1865, most slaves in North America had been born here. The only life they knew was slavery. Then in an instant, they were free. Once slaves knew the truth, they stopped working. The moment was scary and wonderful. They were free. They laughed and cried, shouted and prayed, they danced and sang, they gathered and hugged. They imagined their lives as free Americans. Some former slaves left the plantation with just the clothes on their back. They didn't know where they were going. They were happy just to be free to go anywhere. Many searched for loved ones who had been sold to other plantations. Some were united with their families. Others never found their parents or children. Some former slaves found jobs in cities. Others not. Some former slaves found jobs in cities. Others could not because white people wouldn't hire them. Many stayed on plantations because they had nowhere else to go. The slaves were free, but black people would struggle for equal rights for a long time. Still, the end of slavery brought great joy and a reason to celebrate. On June 19, 1866, 1 year after they had learned of their freedom, former slaves came together to celebrate. The city of Galveston was alive with music. The sweet, smoky smell of barbecue filled the air. In closing, Freedom Days. Americans had different ideas about when to celebrate the end of slavery. Some think it should be January 1st, the day that President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Others feel that December 18th, 1865 was a true date. On this day, the 13th Amendment on the United States Constitution became law. This amendment ended slavery in all the states. The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves only in the Confederate states. And there are people who honor the date when slaves were freed in their own state. Whatever day you choose, freedom is worth celebrating. Thank you. My beautiful people, as I stated earlier, although we're celebrating Juneteenth, I think it's so important that we have a fuller understanding of our rich history. Remember, I call this American history, but I start with Mother Africa. One of the things I want to point out is the t-shirt I have on, and it's actually developed specifically to tell our story more in depth. 1619. It represents one of the stories. As the story goes, 20-odd Negroes were brought to British North America in 1619. And I say British North America because in 1619, we weren't even considered United States yet, so it's so important. One of the things I also want to discuss and bring out, which I'm going to tie into this experience, is the words on the outside: resistance, resilience, remembrance. I'm determined to tell our story through a lens of empowerment, through a lens of dedication, courage, and also that desire to persevere. So I want to start this chronological timeline, which we're going to go left to right, with Mother Africa, because I want to make sure that we have a firm understanding that we have made major contributions, not just to Africa, not just to the Americas, to the world. So the first storyboard I have is about Imhotep. He was the first documented physician architect of the world. He was responsible for the step pyramid. This is what I call STEM: science, technology, engineering, and math. But more importantly, or equally as important, it talks at the very bottom about hypocrisy. Hippocrates. If you know anything about Greek history, Hippocrates, Plato, Aristotle, and that guy named Pythagoras all studied for decades in ancient Egypt. So what I'm showing here is that the African, my ancestors, was extremely instrumental in setting a foundation in what we call STEM: science, technology, engineering, and math. But we had an A to it, STEAM. And the A stands for art, because I believe in every one of those disciplines, there's a design component. So this talks about Imhotep. The next storyboard is called The Birthplace of Modern Mind. And this talks about my ancestors realizing that the earth was not flat. We invented geometry. We built the steam engine. We also were responsible for inventing latitude and longitude, drawing the first accurate map of the world. This is from a book called The Rise and Fall of Alexandria. So one of the things I always want to do, I want to make sure that I add resources to support my research for those that want to go back and study a little bit more. On the table here, we have a couple of books: Blacks in Science, and here's another book about Imhotep. Mother Africa, the birthplace of civilization. So as we take this journey down this way, I want to point out this mythical bird. It's called Sankofa. And the definition of Sankofa is to go back and fetch. So it's a mythical bird that flies forward with its head back, with the understanding in order for one to move forward, they've got to retain and take that rich history, culture, and knowledge as they continue to grow in the world. So this is an extremely important mythical bird. So what I'm doing as a community scholar is taking us back through our history so we can have a better understanding not only who we are, but how we have made a major contribution in the world. The next storyboard in the Mother Africa section is Mother Africa Aeronautics. Here's a glider. 200,000 years ago, our ancestors were spearmen with flight. The next storyboard over here I developed is called the Warriors Women of Benin. So in the 18th century, it was called Dahomey. So Benin and Dahomey are kind of synonymous. But what I'm showing here is that there's this famous movie called Black Panther. And in that movie, they have these amazing, strong, black warrior women. This is what that was taken after. They were actual women that were extremely militaristic and actually guarded the kings back in the 18th and 19th century. Now, this is the first section of Mother Africa, but one of the things I want to share before we go to the next section, where I call the disruption of this great knowledge, I want to point out a couple of things that's not really talked about. This here is wood, and this represents carpentry. This here is metal. This represents metallurgy or blacksmithing. And this here bust is made out of terracotta. And terracotta, as we know it, are used for plants and flowers. But what I'm showing you is these were skill sets that were brought to the Americas to help build America. So not only did they take our ancestors to work on plantations, they knew that we were artisans. So we were not only masonry, metallurgy, and carpentry. We brought a wealth of information around agriculture also to the world. So this is Mother Africa. This is my identity. This is who I am. But here is the disruption of this brilliance. We were stolen from our land, put on the bottom of slave ships, and brought to a foreign countries all over the United States. I like to talk about this section as the enslavement section. I want to start thinking about the words we use. Enslavement section implies that there's a beginning and an end. So this is what I call the disruption. So as I was reading in the book, just imagine that if you're playing or if you're actually in a farm, you're stolen and you're brought over here on slave ships. So one of the things I want to include here are cross-section of slave ships. This is a loose pack, this is a tight pack slave ship. So just imagine, within 18 inches, my ancestors, this is where they ate, they slept, they defecated, they urinated, they menstruated, they gave birth and died. Because of the ones who chose to live, but because of the ones who chose to live, I am here. These are my ancestors. I stand on their shoulders. I'm telling the story of the ones that can't speak for themselves. And talking about our rich history, I think it's important that we put it into context. The enslavement period was about capitalism. So I developed this storyboard to really start looking at the behind the scenes methodology of capitalism. So what I did was I printed out some companies, just a few, that profited from the sale of my ancestors. So I would challenge and encourage everyone out there to actually go online and look up colleges, and look up families, and even look up more companies. You'll find out the foundation of the world as we know it was built on the back of our ancestors. In following this theme of commodification, we were considered less than human. Here's another storyboard called Public Sale of Negroes. And I wanted to actually point out a few things here. These are actual enslaving restraints. This is for a child or a woman. This is for adult. So it would actually put my left leg in this one here and the right leg of another individual over here within 18 inches. For sometimes a couple of months at a time on their back in the bow of a ship where barely a candle could stay lit. We survived, we thrived, and we were resilient. Very sensitive, but very important. One of the new additions to my museum is I wanted to show the importance of how spirituality played in the making of the Negro as we know it, or the colored person. So they used to use religion as a tool of oppression. So I put this board together to support an artifact that I actually have in my collection. And I actually brought this book. Now, I strongly suggest that you do your own research so you can have your own discovery. These are the things that I do to try to tell a fuller story. And so this is an important book to help tell the story of Christianity. So we're going to go even farther down here now. And so here's the story of, once again, capitalization. Cash for Negroes. This is a collar that would put around our ancestors' neck. This is for a child. It's a ball and chain. Look at the size. This is for an ankle. Child restraint. Look at the different sizes. So what would possess someone to treat another human being this way? So branding irons. We were branded twice, once on the continent or on the slave ship or when we arrived in a new world. This would be an O, this could be either a W or an M. You know, one of the stories that I think is most important during this enslavement period is the section or the story of resistance. These are called runaway collars. Hear the bells? One of the things that's not talked about is how much we resisted. We ran away every chance we got. We ran away every chance we got. So it's so important that this story is told. So this storyboard actually shows what a runaway collar looks like. This would be put around one of my ancestors' neck with the belief that if they're running through the thickets or through a wooded area, it would slow them down. So what my ancestor would do is, you can hear this here, they would put mud on the ends and run anyway. We refused to be enslaved. And following up with this theme of resistance, resilience, and remembrance, I wanted to point out one of the most famous freedom fighters, anti-slavery movement, was Harriet Tubman. So I developed this board, and there was a movie recently to show what does resistance look like. Harriet Tubman said that I would have freed more slaves if they knew they were slaves. And so we honor this amazing elder, female elder, for the work she did on the Underground Railroad. One of the most painful psychological impacts of the enslavement period, I did my best to capture in just 2 boards. So I call this the seasoning process. And so I'm always looking at creating opportunity for discussion. So you'll see me put a question mark. I even have a question mark after Black Lives Matter. And it's really about us having that conversation. So what I see here is an enslaver who happened to be white, and there were enslavers that were black also too, but for the purpose of the story, let's assume he's white, but look at his posture. He looks very comfortable. So as this story goes, it was common practice for him to have us beat each other. So let's assume that this is me laying down, and that's my son. He basically said that if you don't take this beating, I'm gonna beat your son. So what do you think I'm gonna do? I'm going to take the beating so my son doesn't have to get beat. What happens when my son, this time, when he helps me up, I say, son, why'd you beat me so hard? What does that do to that relationship? Does it make it stronger? No. Here's another story. Let's assume that's my wife back there. And it was common practice that he would rape her in front of me. How do you think that makes me feel as a black man that can't protect my wife? How do you think she feels knowing that she's not protected? What does that do to that relationship? So as a result of this rape, she's going to, if she happens to have a boy child, she's going to raise him to be submissive, subservient, and docile. In other words, with no esteem, because she's going to live in total fear because of this psychological story that she's going to remember. She's not going to want him to be harmed, so she's going to raise him, to revere him at every chance. You know, and look at this image back here, as if it's been normalized. And by the way, this person here is probably putting salt or lye to pour into the room to inflict more harm. So this is probably one of the most painful sections. And the Willie Lynch letter, it talks about, and there's some question about whether it's true or not, and I have my own feelings about that. I don't think it really matters because the practice is still going on. And as the letter goes, it talks about this white man from the West Indies says he has a perfect way to control his slaves. He's going to pit the old against the new, the young against the old, and light skin against the dark skin. So this is the part of that story that's still so painfully prevalent in the African American community. So we're going to go now we've come out of Mother Africa, we're coming to American chattel slavery, and now I'm going to take you through the Jim Crow section and the last section, which is most important, which I call Stewie Rise, which is inventions and inventors. Thank you very much. So we're now at the third section of the American History Travel Museum. We've gone through Mother Africa, we've gone through American chattel slavery, and now we're at Jim Crow, where I call the section where we're free on paper. So what we have behind me is some storyboards that tell the story of immediately after my ancestors were free, terror took on a whole new meaning. Because no longer were we actually legally slaves, or enslaved, we were actually oppressed by certain laws that were developed specifically to oppress us. And so I developed this storyboard that has a series of signs, and these are replica signs. They're not real, but they tell a story of Jim Crow based on being racialized. And I say racialized because there's this misconception that Jim Crow primarily was centered around black and white. So what I added to this section is a little more depth to create a deeper understanding on what oppression looked like and what othering looked like. So we know about the sign that says help wanted, Irish not apply, and Irish were some of the first indentured servants brought into the eastern part of the Americas through Ellis Island, which is a whole nother story. You would have also seen signs as a result of the Ellis Island immigration: no Polish allowed, no Jews allowed. And I added this to contemporize it, but definitely any kind of reference to homosexuality during that time or gay would have not been permitted. This would have been a sign: no Germans allowed. It's another sign: no Italians allowed. And this is a whole other story as well in terms of Asians as it relates to the Japanese Exclusionary Act as well as the internment camps. And this is about organized religion. So we know that this was a standard: no dogs, no Mexicans, no Negroes. And these are signs that are normally associated with Jim Crow, as some of you may connect to civil rights. But let me give you some deeper context. All those groups, be Polish, Italians, Germans, and Irish, were all considered inferior during the 1920s. They were not considered white. So I put these books on the table to talk about the social construct of race that was really developed as a great division of mankind. So here's a book called The Invention of Whiteness and Birth of a White Nation. So these are reference books that if someone wanted to go deeper and do some more discovery around this whole notion of whiteness, these are good reference books. But I also wanted to bring a couple of books that a couple of authors specifically wanted to talk about the invention of whiteness. This is How Jews Became White Folks and what these say about race in America. And this one is about how the Irish became white. So in other words, after a certain period of time, the dominant culture being those whites that were in power, they allowed these individuals to be considered white because they needed the numbers. So I wanted to really put that into context around Jim Crow. Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, this is when I was born. And so I'd like to point this out to children and young adults, that all this young lady wanted to do was go to school, but they would not afford her the right to an education. So this is hate. This is hate, which is still currently prevalent in terms of our contemporary times. So let's go over to what I call domestic terrorism. Often terrorism is associated with Al-Qaeda and other Muslim groups over in quote unquote the Middle East. But here is probably the oldest gang in America, the mighty empire, the Ku Klux Klan. So I have some graphic images on the table. So I want to give any adults that have children, young children, the heads up. So these are actual images from a book called Without Sanctuaries. This is an actual burning of a gentleman. This is a storyboard that I use primarily to teach with in schools. I normally will ask the question, especially when I have white children in the audience, why do you think she's smiling? I like to talk about socialization, which is currently part of this continual narrative that came out of slavery, that black people are less than human, they're animals, they're savages, they're not worthy of being seen as human. So this would depict how we were dehumanized. The Duluth murders, look it up. It's a very, very prominent story. But I also want at some point talk about complicity. And this is how at this time in American history, there were some white women that were complicit in the brutality of African-American men and women as well. And if I had more time, I would talk about the relationship some white women have to this belief as it relates to Seattle public high schools. And I very seldom show this image here, and I'm hoping you can get a shot of it, Mr. Roger. I superimposed this image here of this sister that was hung from a bridge, and that's her son. But what I did was I intentionally blacked out these circles here so you can see how white adults were socializing their kids to hate black people and see them as less than human. So when you look at these images here and this image here, if there's not an intervention, she'll grow up to be this woman full of hate. So that is the Jim Crow section as it relates to lynchings. And Billie Holiday wrote a steering song called Strange Fruit. And if you haven't heard it, I strongly suggest you listen to it. It's really a song around resistance. So let's look at the contemporary impact of Jim Crow. So I put this storyboard presentation together to really talk about the 13th Amendment. And when we talked about emancipation, they mentioned that slaves were free and the 13th Amendment was developed. But what I wanted to do is make sure that they put a caveat in there. And it says, you were free unless you displayed criminalized behavior. So one of the things that the dominant culture of white men in power did, they came up with these trumped up laws no pun intended, where either vagrancy or loitery were punishable crimes, they would actually pick up our ancestors on the street, put them in jail, and white men would pay their bail. As a result of paying that bail, their extended time became more and more. So before you knew it, they were actually part of a chain gang, and they were working for a lot longer time than they would have if they would have had a lawyer. So I want to point that out. And the relationship, the new Jim Crow, and I always like to pose the question, is there any difference? This is the new slavery. Here again, children being pushed into prison, percentages, documentation, data. The last section I want to talk about over here is American history. This is the top 15 states spending more on prisons and education. You can look it up online. So, is there a difference? Emmett Till, Trayvon Martin, domestic terrorism. Last thing I want to talk about here, we're in Seattle, Washington, and I made this section primarily for my good liberal white friends here to show them that the Klan was just not down south in the Midwest. This is actually in the state of Washington. So here you have the Klan in Seattle, Klan in Bellingham, here's a rally in Renton, but also there's these prominent areas where there were neighborhood covenants: Green Lake, Lowhurst, Broadmoor, Queen Anne, Ballard. They all had one thing in common. No person or person of Asiatic, African, or Negro blood could live here. In other words, there were laws in the books that said you could not live in these neighborhoods. Jim Crow hospitals, Jim Crow stores, and of course, segregated schools. So this is the third section of a 4-part series. And so what I really want to talk about in the next segment is the section that gives me the most joy: African American inventions and inventors. Thank you. We went from Mother Africa to the next section, which I call American chattel slavery. We looked at artifacts, we looked at storyboards, we talked about this thing about we weren't slaves, we were enslaved. We went from American chattel slavery to Jim Crow, which is a section I call free on paper. We looked at how whiteness as a construct was developed and supported through the use of names like Italian, German, Polish, and now we're coming to what I believe is the most important section in the entire museum. It's the shoulders by which I stand. It's African American inventions and inventors. But there's also on the backside a whole nother section. It's called African Americans of STEM. And so the question I always ask in schools, why is STEM always shown and taught through a Eurocentric lens? Meaning, how come my children don't see themselves as it relates to the possibilities and what they've accomplished? So at the bottom here are everyday items that we've either invented, patented, and improved upon. So I'm gonna take you through a few of them. So lemon squeeze, a rolling pin, hairbrush, ice cream scoop. My sisters out there, they're around my age, they know about this hot comb. Egg beater. Pencil sharpener. Goggles. Light switch. Fire extinguisher foam. And the most popular invention on the table most of the time is a super soaker. Let me talk about Mr. Lonnie Johnson, who invented the super soaker. He actually took these proceeds and started building space probes. One of the things about these amazing elders on the table, they're a multi-genius. Jack Johnson, the boxer, actually improved upon this, which is called the wrench. Golf tees, biscuit cutter. We improved the horseshoe. And this is a guitar, and this probably goes back as far as the continent of Africa when you think about the kora, which is one of the first instruments that came out of the continent of Africa. Dustpan. Doorknob. Excuse my back. I'm gonna spin around here. And here we have a caster, which is actually used on chairs with ease and mobility. The gas mask. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of multi-genius. Garrett Morgan, the same ancestor that invented the traffic light, also invented the gas mask. And this is a light bulb where Mr. Lewis Latimer improved the filament inside so it stayed brighter longer. So when I go into schools, I ask the question, primarily to children and young adults, what was it about these ancestors, in spite of everything they've been through? I've taken you through American chattel slavery and Jim Crow. And if you look at some of the dates on some of these, and this happens to be the bandage, it's 1883. 1897. What this is a Reconstruction era. And so I tell them that during this time period, the ancestors were being lynched. So the question becomes, what was it about these ancestors that in spite of everything they've been through, they saw and felt the necessity to use their brilliance to change the world? And in closing, I'm gonna take you through briefly the top part, which is the Blacks in STEM section. Gerald Lawson was one of the first innovators to be on the team that built the console that now PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo use for console games. Donna August on the original design team for the Apple Newton handheld computer. Sister Mae Jamerson, aeronautics, and Mr. Mark Dean down here. And I'm gonna spin around here and I'm gonna talk a little bit about Mark Dean. I think 90% of all these individuals are still alive, but Mark Dean owns 44 patents for the PC. He works for IBM. So the question here again is, when our children see themselves, when our children feel what they've made, then I think they have a better opportunity to change the world. You know, in closing, what I want to do is actually refer to some of the quotes that some of these amazing men and women on these boards have spoke life into me and other young adults. Mr. Mark Dean says, you can be whatever you want to be. There may be obstacles, but there are no limits. Miss Shirley Jackson, one takes the talent one has and does the most one can with that talent. And that's the best pathway to success. Mae Jamerson, she says, don't let anyone rob you of your imagination, your creativity, or your curiosity. It's your place in the world. It's your life. Make it the life you want to live. My beautiful people, it is June 19th, 2020. Very, very turbulent time in American history. I just cannot end this without giving honor to some of my village children that have paid the ultimate price for being murdered at the hands of the police. That will be George Floyd, Miss Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Manuel Ellis, who's right here in the Northwest in the Tacoma area. We must continue to fight for what's best for Black people. It is also census time. And so part of this American History Travel Museum was to show you how we've been marginalized, we've been systematized, they've tried to erase us. There's this 3/5 compromise that's been part of the American story as well. So now's the time, my beautiful people. to get out and vote, because there was a time when they used to have poll tax. We had to pay to vote. So this is your time to be counted. The census is real, you're real. Be counted, be worthy, and be an agent of change. I'm hoping sincerely to see you again real soon in the near future. Love you.